But here's where it gets interesting. I wasn't some UFO believer. I mean, like most rational people, I thought alien abduction stories were complete bullshit, you know? Like, sure, maybe life exists somewhere out there, but coming here to probe humans, that seemed like science fiction nonsense. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. My name is Leela, and I need to give you the background because, like, what happened to me didn't happen in isolation, right? This whole thing was building up from childhood, and I realize now it was all connected. I mean, everything was preparing me for that night when they took me. I grew up in this really small town outside Portland, Oregon. We're talking like 1,200 people small. My parents, Janet and Robert, they were both nurses at the local hospital, super logical, super skeptical of anything they couldn't measure in a hospital chart. Very no-nonsense people. My mom was head of pediatrics, my dad worked in the ER. They dealt with facts, medical evidence, tangible proof, nothing mystical, nothing unexplained. But I was always different, you know? When I was around 5, I started having these really intense nightmares about being examined by tall figures in white coats. My mom would find me screaming in the middle of the night, talking about the doctors with the big eyes who were looking inside my head. I would wake up with this overwhelming sense that someone had been touching me, examining me, but I could never remember specifics. But they weren't like normal doctor dreams. These figures had huge black eyes and elongated fingers, like, oh my god, the headaches. Starting around age 7, I would get these crippling migraines that would last for days, but they weren't normal headaches, right? They felt like pressure building up specifically behind my forehead and around my sinuses, and sometimes I would hear this high-pitched humming sound that nobody else could hear. It was this weird frequency that seemed to resonate inside my skull, particularly around my nasal passages and frontal lobe area. My parents took me to every specialist in Oregon, pediatric neurologists, ENT doctors, even a psychiatrist who thought the headaches might be psychosomatic. CT scans, MRIs, blood work, sinus x-rays, nothing. Dr. Martinez, our family physician, was completely stumped. He said, "Janet, I've never seen anything like this. Lila's scans are completely normal, but she's describing symptoms that suggest some kind of neurological trauma around the frontal lobe region." But what kind of trauma? I was 7 years old living in rural Oregon. What could have happened to me? But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me explain something about consciousness that most people don't understand. We think we're just these physical bodies walking around, but we're actually multidimensional beings operating on multiple frequency levels simultaneously, what we call dreams. That's often astral projection, what we call intuition. That's telepathic transmission from higher dimensional sources. The problem is our education system, our society, it conditions us to ignore these abilities, to dismiss them as imagination. By the time I was 10, the headaches had stopped, but something else started happening. I would have these experiences where I felt like I was floating above my bed watching myself sleep. Initially, I thought they were just really vivid dreams. But then I started noticing details that I couldn't have imagined. Like, I would see my parents downstairs having conversations that I later confirmed actually happened. Or I would observe our neighbor, Mr. Patterson, working in his garage at 2 a.m., and the next day I'd see evidence of exactly what I had witnessed. I tried telling my parents about these experiences, but they were not having it. My mom especially was freaked out. She would get this look of panic whenever I mentioned seeing things I shouldn't be able to see. "Lila, honey, those are just dreams. Your imagination is very active, but you need to learn the difference between fantasy and reality." But it felt real, you know? More real than regular dreams. When you dream normally, there's this fuzzy quality to everything, this dreamlike logic where things don't quite make sense. But these out-of-body experiences had this crystal clear quality, this heightened awareness that felt more real than waking life. This was the late 90s, so the internet was just becoming a thing, but I spent hours in our little town library reading books about consciousness, out-of-body experiences, astral projection, remote viewing. In high school, I started researching this stuff on my own. I learned that what I was experiencing had names, that other people throughout history had reported similar phenomena. I discovered books by Robert Monroe, who founded the Monroe Institute and pioneered research into out-of-body experiences. I read about remote viewing programs that the military had supposedly used during the Cold War. I studied ancient texts about consciousness exploration from various cultures. The more I learned, the more I realized my experiences weren't just imagination. They were accessing expanded states of consciousness that most people don't know exist. But I kept it secret because, who's going to believe a teenager from rural Oregon can consciously leave her body and travel to other locations? My parents already thought I was weird enough. I didn't need to give them more reasons to worry about my mental health. By the time I graduated, I was having full-blown conscious out-of-body experiences. I could intentionally leave my physical form and travel anywhere I wanted. I could remote view locations I'd never been to, access information from what some researchers call the Akashic Records, this theoretical field that contains all information about past, present, and future events. I would visit friends' houses and observe what they were doing, then confirm details later. I went to Portland State University for psychology, thinking maybe I could understand these abilities from a scientific perspective. Maybe I could bridge the gap between metaphysical experiences and academic research. But traditional psychology was so limiting, you know? If you're having psychic experiences, you must have a dissociative disorder. If you're seeing things others can't see, you're probably schizophrenic. They couldn't conceive that these might be expanded states of consciousness rather than mental illness. I remember this one professor, Dr. Williams, who taught abnormal psychology. I made the mistake of writing a paper about consciousness expansion and psychic phenomena. He called me into his office and basically told me I was delusional. He said, "Miss Anderson, I'm concerned about your grasp on reality. These experiences you're describing are classic symptoms of several psychiatric conditions, but I knew what I was experiencing was real. I had too much verifiable evidence, too many confirmed remote viewing sessions, too many out-of-body experiences that provided information I couldn't have known otherwise. So I learned to keep my mouth shut and play along with conventional academic expectations. After college, I moved to this small cabin in the Cascade Mountains, about 2 hours east of Portland. I got this job as a research assistant at a private institute that studied consciousness and alternative healing modalities. Finally, I thought, somewhere I can explore this stuff academically without being labeled as mentally ill. But even in consciousness research, there were limits. We could study meditation, we could research altered states induced by sensory deprivation, we could investigate the placebo effect and mind-body healing. But anything involving psychic phenomena, or, God forbid, extraterrestrial contact was completely taboo. Career suicide, they told me. I was living alone in this really isolated cabin, perfect for my consciousness work, but also, I realize now, perfect for what they had planned. The nearest neighbor was probably 3 miles away. No streetlights, no traffic noise, just dense forest all around. I had chosen the location specifically because it was conducive to deep meditation and out-of-body experiences. That's when the physical contact happened. It was a Thursday night in October. I remember because I had been doing this 3-day fasting protocol as preparation for a consciousness expansion experiment I was conducting on myself. Fasting, I had learned from various esoteric traditions, thins the veil between dimensions and makes interdimensional contact more likely. I had been consuming nothing but water for 72 hours, spending most of my time in deep meditation. I fell asleep around 10 p.m. after what had been probably my most intense meditation session ever. I felt like I had accessed levels of consciousness I'd never reached before. My awareness felt expanded, like I was simultaneously conscious of multiple dimensions of reality. It was incredible, but also exhausting. Around 2003 a.m., I woke up paralyzed. Like, completely paralyzed, but fully conscious. Sleep paralysis is a known phenomenon, but this felt different. This felt intentional, controlled, and standing at the foot of my bed were 3 beings. They were tall, maybe 7 feet, with elongated limbs and these huge black eyes that took up most of their faces. Their skin was this grayish-white color, almost translucent, and I could see what looked like a network of veins or energy channels beneath the surface. They had no hair, no visible ears, just these smooth, elongated heads that seemed too large for their thin necks. The terror I felt was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. But it wasn't normal fear. It felt chemically induced, artificially amplified. Like they were broadcasting fear directly into my nervous system to keep me compliant. I tried to scream but couldn't move my vocal cords. I tried to sit up but couldn't move any part of my body. I could only watch as they approached. The strangest thing was the complete lack of communication. With all my consciousness work, all my experience with telepathic connection during meditation, I was expecting some kind of mental contact. But there was nothing. They treated me like I was just biological material, not a conscious being worth communicating with. Without any warning or explanation, they lifted me from my bed. I remember looking down and seeing one of my socks had fallen off during the night. Such a weird detail to focus on when you're being abducted, right? Like my mind was trying to hold on to something normal, something mundane, in the middle of this impossible situation. They carried me through the wall, like literally through the solid log wall of my cabin. The sensation was indescribable. I could feel the molecular structure of the wood as we passed through it, like everything was just vibrating energy at different frequencies. It didn't hurt, but it was profoundly disorienting. Outside, there was this craft hovering maybe 50 feet above my cabin. It wasn't like the flying saucers you see in movies, it was more organic looking, almost like it was grown rather than built. The surface seemed to shift and pulse with this soft blue-white light. Looking at it, I somehow understood that this wasn't just a vehicle, it was a living entity, some kind of biotechnological consciousness. We floated up into the craft through what appeared to be a solid surface, but allowed us to pass through like we were moving through thick water. Inside was unlike anything I could have imagined. The walls seemed to pulse with that same organic light, and the space felt much larger inside than it had appeared from outside. The geometry was wrong somehow. Corners that shouldn't exist, surfaces that curved in impossible directions. They brought me to this chamber in what I assumed was the center of the craft. It was circular, with these crystalline formations growing from the walls and ceiling that emitted different colored lights in rhythmic patterns. In the center was this examination table that looked like it was made from the same organic material as the ship itself. As they placed me on the table, the surface seemed to mold itself to my body, supporting me perfectly but also restraining me completely. I couldn't move anything except my eyes, and what I saw was terrifying. There were maybe 6 other beings in the chamber, all watching me like I was some kind of laboratory specimen, but these weren't the same beings who had taken me from my bed. These were different, taller, more imposing, with an air of authority. One of them approached with what looked like a collection of medical instruments, but nothing like any Earth technology I'd ever seen. The lead being, who I somehow understood was the scientist or doctor, began the procedure. The first thing they did was scan my entire body with this device that emitted a soft humming sound. I could feel it somehow reading my biological systems, mapping my neural pathways, analyzing my consciousness in ways I couldn't comprehend. Then came the physical intervention. The being approached with this needle-like device seemed to shift and change configuration as it moved. It was unlike anything from Earth technology, part organic, part metallic, with these tiny filaments extending from its tip like microscopic tentacles. Without any anesthetic, without any preparation, they began inserting it through my left nostril. The pain was unimaginable, like they were drilling directly through my nasal cavity and up into my frontal lobe with a red-hot probe. I tried to scream but couldn't make any sound. The pain was so intense I could taste metal in my mouth, and I felt this horrible pressure building behind my forehead as the device pushed deeper into my sinuses. The device seemed to be threading itself through my sinus cavities and into my frontal lobe, connecting directly to the parts of my brain responsible for psychic abilities and consciousness expansion. But it wasn't just physical pain. I could feel them accessing my memories, my thoughts, my entire consciousness through this nasal pathway. The procedure lasted maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. They were installing something, some kind of organic nanotechnology that interfaced directly with my neural pathways through my nasal passages. I could feel it spreading through my frontal sinuses, connecting to my pineal gland, my prefrontal cortex, regions associated with consciousness and psychic perception. During the installation, I experienced these flashes of information, glimpses of their civilization, their technology, their purpose here on Earth. They were part of a species from a star system I couldn't identify, conducting long-term research on human consciousness evolution. Humans with developed psychic abilities were particularly valuable subjects because we represented the next stage in human development. But here's what really shocked me. I wasn't their first subject. Through the neural interface, I could access memories of other abductions, other humans who had undergone similar nasal procedures. Thousands of people over decades, all having tracking devices implanted through their sinuses, all being monitored as part of some vast experiment. When the procedure was finished, they returned me to my cabin the same way they had taken me, floating through the wall and placing me back in my bed. The nasal implant was active, and I could feel it constantly monitoring my brain activity, my consciousness levels, my psychic development through the neural pathways they had accessed. But I wasn't the same person who had been taken. I woke up the next morning around 6 a.m., still paralyzed but gradually regaining control of my body. When I could finally move, I went to my bathroom mirror. My nose was bleeding, dark, thick blood that had dried around my nostrils and on my upper lip. There was also this weird discharge, like clear fluid mixed with the blood, leaking from my left nostril. But more disturbing than the physical evidence was the feeling of being watched. For the next month, I felt like they were monitoring me 24/7 through whatever they had implanted in my sinuses. This overwhelming paranoia that every thought, every emotion, every psychic experience was being recorded and transmitted back to them through the device in my nasal cavity. I stopped meditating, stopped doing out-of-body work, stopped everything that had defined my spiritual practice for years. I felt like a prisoner in my own mind, knowing that something alien was constantly observing my thoughts and experiences through the neural pathways in my frontal lobe. 2 weeks after the abduction, I went to see Dr. Harrison, my family physician back in Portland. I couldn't tell him I'd been abducted by aliens. He already thought I was slightly eccentric from my consciousness research work. So I just said I'd been having severe sinus pain and mysterious bleeding episodes. He examined my nasal passages with his scope. The left nostril looked normal from the outside, but when he looked deeper, his expression changed. Lila, there's significant scar tissue in your left sinus cavity, particularly around the ethmoid area. What kind of trauma did you experience? This looks like surgical scarring, but there's no record of any nasal surgery in your medical history. I pressed him for more details. Could he see any foreign objects, any implants, any explanation for the scarring? He said the scarring was unusual and extensive for someone your age, but he couldn't see anything that looked like a foreign object with his basic equipment. However, he recommended I see an ENT specialist for a more thorough examination. Dr. Patricia Gomez, the ENT specialist, was even more puzzled. She did a CT scan of my sinuses and found something that made her very concerned. Lila, there's some kind of dense mass or tissue formation in your left frontal sinus near the base of your frontal lobe. It's not like anything I've seen before. The tissue appears to be organic, but has this unusual metallic density that's showing up on the scan. She pointed to the images on her computer screen. See this area here? I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of practice. She wanted to do exploratory surgery to remove whatever was causing the density anomaly, but something inside me, maybe the implant itself, made me refuse. It's about the size of a small pea, but it's much denser than normal tissue. It's positioned right at the interface between your sinus cavity and your frontal cortex. I knew that conventional medicine couldn't help me with this problem, and I was terrified that attempting surgical removal might trigger some kind of defensive response from the device. I told her I needed to think about it, but I never went back. That's when I decided to try something completely different. Through my consciousness research network, I'd heard about Dr. Patricia Reeves, this medical intuitive who worked with people who'd had unusual experiences that conventional medicine couldn't explain. I was desperate, you know? I'd tried conventional medicine, I'd tried ignoring the problem, nothing was working. I drove down to her office in Eugene without calling ahead. I didn't tell her anything about what had happened. I just said, please scan my body and tell me what you find. I don't want to influence what you see. She had me lie down on this treatment table and started moving her hands a few inches above my body. She wasn't touching me, just kind of sensing my energy field or whatever. Within about 30 seconds, she stopped over my face and got this really concerned expression. Oh honey, she said, you've been chipped. There's a highly sophisticated implant in your left frontal sinus, and it's actively monitoring your consciousness. I almost started crying right there on the table. Not only did she confirm what I already suspected, but she described details I hadn't told anyone. It has these tiny neural filaments that extend through your sinus cavity and into your frontal lobe, specifically targeting your prefrontal cortex and the regions associated with psychic abilities. It's monitoring your consciousness levels, your psychic development, your emotional states, everything. She said the beings who had implanted it were studying humans with advanced consciousness development. They're tracking how your psychic abilities develop, how you process different types of consciousness expansion, how your neural pathways adapt to various stimuli. But here's what really shocked me. She said I wasn't the only one. This device, she explained, is made from some kind of organic nanotechnology, but it's definitely not from Earth. You're like a research subject to them. I've worked with dozens of people who've had similar nasal implant experiences. There's a whole network of humans being monitored this way, through devices inserted into their sinuses. It's like you're all part of some long-term study of human consciousness evolution. Dr. Reeves offered to remove the implant energetically. She explained that these devices operate on both physical and energetic levels, and that energetic removal could neutralize their connection to my consciousness even if the physical components remained. For about an hour, she worked on what she called dimensional healing techniques. She would place her hands near different parts of my head and make these subtle adjustments that I could actually feel as shifts in pressure and energy flow. Sometimes she would pause and say things like, okay, I'm disconnecting the neural filaments from your pineal gland now, or I'm neutralizing the monitoring frequency that's connected to your prefrontal cortex. I could actually feel something changing during the session. I was skeptical. How could energy work remove physical nanotechnology embedded in my brain tissue? But I was desperate enough to try anything. There was this sense of pressure being released from deep inside my skull, particularly around my sinuses and forehead. At one point, I felt this weird popping sensation behind my left nostril, like something had been disconnected. Immediately after the session, I felt different. The constant feeling of being monitored was gone. That paranoid sense that my thoughts were being recorded and transmitted somewhere else just vanished. For the first time in months, I felt like my mind was truly my own again. The implant is still physically there, doctor. Think of it like unplugging a device. The hardware is still there, but it's not functional anymore. She warned me that I might experience some physical symptoms as the device became inactive, Reeves explained, but it's no longer connected to your consciousness. You might get some unusual drainage as your body starts to expel the organic components, she told me. But other than that, you should start feeling much better, and the drainage did get worse before it got better. For the next 6 months, that greenish-black fluid was leaking from my left nostril almost constantly. I had to carry a box of tissues with me everywhere and change them every few minutes. The smell got stronger too, that metallic copper penny odor that made people back away from me in public. Dr. Harrison, my family physician, was completely baffled when I showed him samples of the discharge during this period. There are also trace amounts of what appear to be metallic nanoparticles, but we don't have the equipment to analyze them properly. But the worst part during this period wasn't the physical symptoms. He sent it to the lab multiple times, but the results were always inconclusive. The fluid contains organic compounds we can't identify, he told me. It was the social isolation that followed my attempt to tell someone about what had happened. I made the mistake of trying to confide in my roommate Jessica about the experience. Jessica and I had been friends since college. She was into yoga and meditation, crystal healing, all that spiritual stuff. So I thought she'd be more open-minded about unusual experiences, right? Like if anyone would understand, it would be her. Instead, she completely freaked out. We were sitting in our kitchen having coffee, and I had been debating for weeks whether to tell her. Jessica, I said, I need to tell you something really important, but I need you to promise you'll listen with an open mind. She nodded, but I could already see her getting that look, that careful expression people get when they think you're about to say something crazy. The constant nasal drainage was getting worse. I was having trouble sleeping because of residual paranoia, and I desperately needed someone to talk to about what was happening. I told her everything. The abduction, the nasal procedure, the implant, the medical visits, the ongoing drainage. I showed her the medical documentation, Dr. Gomez's CT scans showing the anomalous mass, the lab results on the mysterious discharge. I even showed her some of the thick, greenish fluid that was constantly leaking from my nose. Jessica listened to the whole story, but her expression kept getting more and more concerned. Not concerned for me, concerned about me. Lila, you need professional help, she told me when I finished. What you're describing sounds like a psychotic episode. People don't get abducted by aliens and implanted with tracking devices through their nose. But she dismissed it all as coincidental medical anomalies that I was misinterpreting through the lens of what she called a mental breakdown. You've been under a lot of stress with your consciousness research, she said. That's not how reality works. I tried to explain that I had medical documentation, that multiple doctors had confirmed there was something unusual in my sinuses. Sometimes when people get too deep into that metaphysical stuff, they lose their grip on what's real and what's fantasy. That hurt, Not just anyone, she told our entire social circle that I was having a psychotic break and believed I'd been probed by aliens through my nose. 8 people who I considered close friends suddenly started treating me like I was completely delusional. But what she did next was even worse. Jessica started telling people. These were people who had known me for years, who knew I was rational and grounded despite my interest in consciousness research. But the moment the word aliens was mentioned, I became a crazy person in their eyes. I remember this party at our friend Mike's house about 2 weeks later. Jessica had apparently told everyone about my alien delusions as some kind of cautionary tale about what happens when you get too deep into that metaphysical stuff. Sarah, who had been one of my closest friends since college, actually approached me with this patronizing smile and said, Lila, we're all really worried about you. I walked in and the entire room went quiet. Actually quiet. Conversations just stopped. Jessica told us you think you were abducted by aliens and that they put something in your nose. Have you considered talking to a psychiatrist? The humiliation was devastating. These were people I trusted, people I had shared my deepest secrets with over the years. And now they were all looking at me like I was some kind of mental patient who needed to be handled carefully. Mark, this guy I had dated briefly, actually laughed when Sarah mentioned the nasal implant. Wait, they went through her nose? What, they were doing alien sinus surgery? The whole group started snickering, and I felt like I wanted to disappear into the floor. I tried to defend myself, to explain that I had medical documentation, but nobody wanted to hear it. Jessica had already poisoned the well by framing my experience as a mental health crisis rather than something that might actually be real. "Lila, honey," said Amy, this woman who I thought was a friend, "I think you need to take a step back from all that consciousness research stuff. It's clearly affecting your ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy." I left that party and basically became a hermit for the next 4 months. The isolation was crushing, but it was better than facing the constant judgment and whispered conversations about poor Lila who thinks she was abducted by aliens. What made it even worse was that I started doubting myself, you know? I stopped going out, stopped socializing, stopped answering calls from friends. When everyone you trust tells you that you're delusional, part of you starts to wonder if maybe they're right. Maybe the medical evidence was just coincidental. Gomez's CT scans showing that weird mass in my frontal sinus, or I would catch another whiff of that metallic discharge leaking from my nose, and I knew that something real had happened to me. Maybe I had experienced some kind of psychological break. Maybe I was losing my mind. But then I would look at Dr. Something that couldn't be explained by conventional medicine or psychology. The turning point came about 5 months after the medical intuitive session, when the nasal drainage had finally started to slow down. I was doing a light meditation, nothing intense, just basic relaxation, when I felt this familiar sensation of my awareness expanding beyond my physical body. But instead of the terror I now associated with non-physical contact, I felt this overwhelming sense of peace and unconditional love. 3 beings materialized in my living room, but they were completely different from the cold, clinical entities who had violated me. These beings were tall and elegant, with flowing robes that seemed to be made of light itself. Their faces were beautiful in an otherworldly way, high cheekbones, large, compassionate eyes, and this gentle luminescence that emanated from their entire forms. The moment they appeared, I was flooded with telepathic communication that felt like the most natural thing in the world. Unlike the invasive mental probing I had experienced during the abduction, this felt like having a conversation with beloved friends who understood me completely. "We are deeply sorry for the trauma you underwent." Through this telepathic exchange, I learned that there are dozens of extraterrestrial civilizations interacting with Earth, and they fall into several distinct categories. "Lila," the lead being communicated, "we are representatives of the Andromedan Council, and we want you to know that not all extraterrestrial contact is like what you experienced. Some, like the beings who had abducted me, which the Andromedans called the Zeta Collective, are primarily interested in biological and consciousness research. They treat humans as laboratory subjects and use traumatic procedures to study how consciousness interfaces with biological systems. Others are more malevolent, seeking to exploit human resources, genetic material, or consciousness for their own purposes. But there are also benevolent groups, the Andromedans, the Pleiadians, certain factions of what they called the Galactic Federation, who are working to assist humanity's consciousness evolution. These groups often work with certain human military factions in exchange for advanced technology. They operate under what they called cosmic law, which prohibits direct interference with a species' free will and natural development. The traumatic experience you underwent, the being explained, while horrible, served a purpose in your soul's development. Sometimes trauma is the catalyst that awakens beings to their true potential. They showed me that Earth is approaching what they called a consciousness transition point, a natural evolutionary leap where humanity will develop expanded psychic abilities and join the galactic community. It shattered your psychological barriers and forced a rapid expansion of your consciousness. But this transition is being both assisted and hindered by various extraterrestrial groups with different agendas. The benevolent beings work through inspiration, dreams, meditation experiences, and positive contact with ready individuals. The less benevolent groups work through fear, manipulation, and trauma-based consciousness modification. Both approaches, they explained, can lead to consciousness expansion, but the paths and outcomes are very different. You were chosen by the Zetas because of your natural psychic abilities, they told me. They were telling me that I had volunteered, at a soul level, to experience both the dark and light aspects of extraterrestrial contact, so I could help other humans understand the complexity of what's really happening on our planet. But you were also chosen by us, long before your incarnation, to serve as a bridge between human and galactic consciousness. This blew my mind, right? Over the following months, I had regular contact with the Andromedan Council. Unlike my abduction experience, these encounters were always in safe, sacred space, usually during deep meditation in my cabin. They began teaching me about galactic civilization, consciousness evolution, and the role that awakened humans are meant to play in Earth's transition. They showed me that there are thousands of humans around the world who have had similar experiences, traumatic contact followed by benevolent guidance. were like advanced scouts, consciousness pioneers who incarnated specifically to help bridge the gap between human and galactic awareness. But here's what really changed my perspective on the whole experience. They explained that the trauma I had undergone was actually preparation for advanced consciousness work. The nasal implant the Zetas had installed, while invasive, violating, had also created permanent changes in my frontal lobe that enhanced my psychic abilities exponentially. Think of it as unwanted surgery that nonetheless provided beneficial modifications, they explained. The Zetas were studying human consciousness, but they also inadvertently prepared you for higher dimensional work. And it was true. After the implant was energetically deactivated, my psychic abilities were far beyond anything I had experienced before. I could consciously project my consciousness anywhere in the galaxy. I could communicate telepathically with various extraterrestrial civilizations. I also started experiencing what they called downloads, sudden influxes of information about advanced physics, consciousness principles, galactic history, and Earth's role in the cosmic community. I could access information from what they called the Galactic Collective Consciousness, a field of shared knowledge that connects all awakened beings across the universe. Sometimes I would wake up knowing things I had never studied, understanding concepts that human science hasn't even discovered yet. But the most profound change was in my understanding of trauma and healing. The Andromedans taught me that consciousness expansion often requires the breaking down of existing mental structures. Sometimes this happens through meditation and gradual spiritual practice. Sometimes it happens through psychedelic experiences or near-death encounters. And sometimes it happens through traumatic contact that forces rapid consciousness evolution. The experience you underwent was terrible, they acknowledged, but it served your soul's purpose. You now have the credibility and understanding to help other humans navigate similar experiences, and that became my mission. But humanity needs bridge workers, people who can help others understand that we're not alone and that the reality is far more complex than simple good aliens versus bad aliens. I started working with other experiencers who had undergone similar nasal implant procedures. Through my ongoing contact with the Andromedan Council, I learned that disclosure of extraterrestrial presence on Earth is accelerating. Many reported the same pattern: traumatic insertion through nasal passages, months of metallic discharge, followed by dramatically enhanced psychic abilities. It's like we've been unwittingly prepared to serve as communication interfaces between human and galactic consciousness. Dr. Reeves, the medical intuitive who had helped me, connected me with a network of practitioners who work with ET experiences. What's fascinating is that many of us report similar capabilities after implant deactivation, enhanced psychic abilities, access to galactic information networks, ongoing contact with benevolent extraterrestrial civilizations. I discovered there are hundreds of people around the world who have had verified nasal implant experiences, complete with medical documentation and physical evidence. It's like we've been prepared to serve as translators between human and cosmic consciousness. Through remote viewing sessions guided by the Andromedans, I've been able to observe some of the secret programs where human-extraterrestrial collaboration is happening right now, and underground facilities where human scientists work alongside various ET researchers on consciousness technology interface projects. Military installations where recovered ET technology is being reverse engineered. Government facilities where human psychics are being trained to work with extraterrestrial intelligence networks. But I've also seen the benevolent side of this interaction. There are positive ET groups working with certain human factions to prepare for open contact. They're sharing technology for free energy, environmental restoration, consciousness healing, but this information is being suppressed by the same power structures that profit from the current system of scarcity and control. The Andromedans explained that full disclosure is inevitable, but it's being managed carefully to prevent social collapse. Your species is not ready for the shock of learning that you've never been alone, that you've been subjects of study and manipulation for millennia, they told me. The revelation must come gradually, through individuals like you who can prepare others for the truth. That's why I'm sharing this story now, because if you've read this far, if these concepts resonate with you, you might be one of the bridge workers too. You might be part of this network of consciousness pioneers who incarnated to help humanity through this transition. The signs are everywhere if you know how to look. The increasing UFO disclosures from military sources, the growing number of people reporting ET contact experiences, the rapid development of consciousness research and psychic abilities training, the emergence of technologies that seem to bridge the gap between consciousness and machines. But when that happens, humanity will need guides, people who have already processed the shock, integrated the trauma, and developed working relationships with benevolent ET civilizations. If you're having unusual experiences, dreams about being examined, missing time episodes, unexplained physical symptoms like unusual nasal discharge, sudden downloads of information you've never studied, don't dismiss them as imagination. We're approaching a time when the truth about extraterrestrial presence will be undeniable to everyone. Document everything. Seek out medical verification when possible. Connect with others who are having similar experiences. And most importantly, don't let anyone convince you that your experiences aren't real. When humanity learns that we've never been alone, that consciousness is far more than just brain chemistry, that reality is much stranger and more wonderful than we've been taught. Everything changes. The future of human consciousness depends on people like us, the experiencers, the contactees, the bridge workers who've experienced both the dark and light aspects of extraterrestrial interaction. The gaslighting is intense because the truth threatens existing power structures. We're the ones who can help others understand that contact isn't something to fear, but something to prepare for with discernment and wisdom. I still have regular communication with the Andromedan Council, usually during deep meditation sessions in my cabin. They continue to provide guidance about Earth's transition and my role in preparing others for contact. The physical trauma I experienced through that nasal procedure was horrible, but it led to the most meaningful work of my life. And that bloody, violated nose that started this whole journey, it's now the most sensitive receiver of galactic consciousness transmissions I could have asked for. The frontal lobe modifications created by that traumatic implantation have given me access to information networks I never knew existed. Sometimes the universe works in mysterious ways, preparing us for our missions through experiences we would never choose but ultimately serve our highest purpose. The path through trauma to transformation isn't easy, but for those of us called to be bridge workers between worlds, it's the journey that makes us who we're meant to be. We're not alone, we never have been, and we're approaching a time when that truth will transform everything about how we understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos. The bridge workers are here. The transition has begun, and the future of human consciousness depends on how well we navigate this extraordinary time in our species' evolution.